Hey everybody, welcome back for week 2 of our study of the life of Abraham. Glad you're joining us, and if you're the person who clicked dislike on my last video, extra glad that you're back for this one. Hopefully we'll redeem ourselves here. I'm hopeful that the study this week was beneficial. I'm hopeful that the workbook was helpful in thinking through the text. If you have any questions as you're working through it, again, just want to put another offer out there. Feel free to shoot me an email. My email's on our website. Would love to talk with you about any questions you have as you work through the study. So we are in month 10 of sheltering in place, of quarantine, or maybe pseudo-quarantine at this point in time. And I feel like everybody has developed different coping mechanisms or different strategies for surviving shelter in place in the midst of the pandemic. And one thing that I've noticed is that people have been doing a lot of nesting behaviors. So they're fixing up their house, they're doing house projects, they're working on things, and they're trying to keep themselves busy. We were no exception to that. So we kind of turned our attention to our backyard, and we put a lot of focus on, we kind of started a garden. We bought some chickens. They're very functional babysitters for 3-year-olds, if that's helpful to you. And we started a compost bin. And I've been really amazed at this compost bin and how much less we are throwing away now that we're using it. But compost is a weird thing. It's kind of gross. We put chicken poop in it. We put a lot of food scraps in it. In the summer, we had a lot of bug activity in it, but over time the compost, it breaks down and it forms soil. And what you do with this compost is eventually you need to test whether or not it's effective soil or if it needs more time in decomposition. And so you do this testing to see if your compost is cooked, as they call it. And one way you test it is by you grab a bag of compost and you Ziploc it, you leave it on your counter for a week, and after a week you smell it. And if it smells like dirt, you're good. And if it smells like rotting food, it needs more time. And so we undertook that test. It was a little bit unnerving knowing all the things that we put into the compost, smelling it after a week, but we found that it was cooked, which was good. But when we think about testing our compost for our application, we're trying to figure out, is it going to be suitable to sustain plant life? When we think about testing there, it's not really a pass-fail that we're thinking about. We're thinking, is this ready? Is this doing what it's supposed to be doing? And what we see in Abraham's story is marked by a series of tests. Over and over again, we're going to see Abraham is tested. His faith is put to the test. And it's not a pass-fail scenario. What these tests do is they reveal to us the nature of Abraham's faith. And so our main idea for our teaching today is that the testing of our faith reveals the object of our worship. The testing of our faith reveals the object of our worship. And so last time I gave you a very high level overview of Genesis 1 through 11. I want to pick back up in Genesis 11 and recall where we were in our story. You had a little bit in your workbook prompting you to look back at the end of Genesis 11. And so where we were in the stories, we just encountered multiple stories of the rebellion of man, right? Beginning in the Garden of Eden, coming to a kind of climax before the judgment of the flood, and then coming to another climax at the Tower of Babel. And that happens in chapter 11. God comes down, he scatters the nations across the earth. And at the conclusion of chapter 11, we get another one of these Toledot formulas, which we talked about last time. So it's this introductory phrase saying the descendants of, or in the line of. And we see 10 generations pass from the descendants of Noah to a guy named Terah and his sons. And so a few things ought to stick out to us as careful readers of the text when we see this introductory phrase and kind of this formula being used. Anytime we're seeing a Toledot and 10 generations, the introduction that's being used here is calling back to the previous one. So Terah is being presented here. He's had 10 generations pass, and then the text tells us about his 3 sons. Well, the last time we saw that was Noah, who had 10 generations pass before him, and he had 3 sons. And if we look 10 generations before him, who do we have but Adam, who had 3 sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. And so Terah is being presented to us here as kind of a pattern that's recurring in our story of somebody who is taking on the mantle of their descendants are going to have an important role here. We're looking at their descendants to get keyed in on how God's redemptive purposes will be playing out. That was the hope with Adam's descendants. We were looking at his sons to see how will the purpose of God to foil the serpent play out. We're looking at that with the descendants of Noah. And with both of these, we found that their descendants were not what God was ultimately working towards. There were some good moments in there, some descendants that pursued righteousness, but overall didn't fix the story. And so we make our way to Terah, and what we have is we are left with a sense of expectation, a sense of hope that God is still going to make good on the shadow of a promise that was given in Genesis 3, that the descendant of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And so let's talk about who Terah is. So he's presented as the father of three. This may not be an exhaustive list of all his sons. He's probably presented in this format again. So we'll think about him like we think about Adam, like we think about Noah. And when we think about who he is, for us, it's just a name. But for the original audience, hearing the name Terah, they would have immediately known where he's from and what he's like, because his name is actually borrowed from a Sumerian cult that worshipped the moon. And so the fact that he's named Terah lets us know, and the fact that he's identified as being from Ur and from Haran lets us know that he is participating in a Sumerian cult that worships the moon. And so this is kind of a surprising revelation for us, that the guy who the story is now focusing on, 10 generations, a complete passage of time after Noah, is a pagan, right? And Abraham is descending from a pagan. So it's not like he's raised in a godly household. But at the same time, so that may be surprising on the one hand. On the other hand, it's good news for us, right? Because God is in the business of saving pagans. I know that's true of my story. I imagine it's true of your story. Every one of us is a pagan when God finds us and when God saves us. And so we're given this backdrop of Abram is not really raised in a house that fears the Lord. He's raised in a culture that is involved in idolatrous practices. But again, the good news for us is God is in the business of saving pagans. We get some key details here in the background here of the very tail end of chapter 11. So we've kind of got, just by his name, we know a little bit about Terah. We have the sense of expectation for his sons. Another key detail that's dropped here is that Sarai was barren. And I should give a caveat right now. I'll probably interchangeably use Abram and Abraham just because we're so familiar with Abraham. But at this moment in the story, he is Abram. At this moment in the story, she is Sarai. And we're given this detail that Sarai was barren. Again, if we're thinking about this principle of narrative scarcity, that the text is only giving us crucial details, the fact that it's dropping this right at the start of our story ought to be a big indicator for us. This is significant. And if you're familiar with the story of Abram, what you're going to find is that the whole story revolves around his descendants or his lack thereof. So this detail with Sarai is cluing us in on what the whole story will be about. But it's also interesting that it's given up front, because we could read this in two different ways. One way we could read this is the narrators cluing us in on what's going to happen, kind of a third person omniscient. But the other way we could read this is that perhaps it's already known in real time that Sarai is barren. What we're going to find later in the text is that Abram is older. He's 75, Sarai is 65. And so they are advanced in age already at the outset of our story. It's possible that Sarai's already been through menopause. Perhaps she was married previously and unable to have a child, and so she was divorced for that. We're not given details on it. The reason I point it out is because there is a possibility that this statement that Sarai was barren is more than just setting up a problem to come, which I think it certainly is doing. It may also be an indicator of the character of Abram. Is Abram the kind of guy who would marry a woman even if she were barren? And so that's kind of shaping our understanding of who Abram is from the outset. A man who's selfless, who's not tied to the having of progeny or offspring afterwards. Another key detail that happens at the tail end of chapter 11 here, this can sound kind of tongue-in-cheek to say, but we see Terah died. And so Terah died, that's kind of the opening of Genesis 12. It's what prompts Abram to move on from Haran to a new place. One thing I want to call out about the death of Terah and the death of those who are coming previously, when we read this story, the thing that we get preoccupied with is how long these people are living, right? Terah lived over 200 years. The people who come before him live even longer than that. And so we're kind of preoccupied with what the heck are these big numbers? But actually, the thing that the author probably would have been more concerned with, he wasn't as concerned with the fact that they were living long lives. What he wants to draw our attention to is that these people are dying. If we remember the context of the story, man was created to live eternally or immortally with God. And what we see is ever since Adam, people keep dying. It's the recurring repetition of Genesis. Somebody lives for a hugely long time. They may do great things in their life, but always, inevitably, it concludes with death. And so the death of Terah and the death that precedes him is a reminder to us as readers that this world is not what it ought to be. It's another moment in which we are recalling this is exile. We are not in the garden as we should be. And again, we are filled with hope of will there come a descendant from Terah who will set things right for us. So all this is setting up our story here, which begins in chapter 12. So Genesis 12, 1 through 9, begins with this introductory phrase, "Now the Lord said to Abram." And this can be kind of a, wait, what do you mean? This is not a lot of detail given in this moment. This is one of those moments in the Bible where I would like a little bit more. When we say the Lord said to Abram, what did that look like? Did he come to him in a vision? Did he appear in a burning bush like he did with Moses? Did he come through an angelic messenger? And the fact is the text doesn't tell us. The text doesn't tell us. And I think that's intentional. The text doesn't tell us because, like we talked about last week, the goal of the story is not just to present a portrait of Abram as his life played out. The point of this text is to invite us into the story and to consider how our lives are similar to Abram's life. And so when the text sets us up by saying, "Now the Lord said to Abram," part of what that's doing is it's leaving room for interpretation for us to think about, how did the Lord meet us? In what circumstance did the Lord meet me? So I want you to ask yourself that as you think about the story of Abram and his calling. Where did the Lord meet you? What did that look like? Now the Lord said to Abram. And so we have an indication that God is talking to Abram. We should also note from the outset, Abram, his name is significant. And so this is true of Hebrew literature in general, Hebrew culture in general. The meaning of names is really important. This is something that's kind of coming back in vogue, I feel like, with our generation. I hear a lot of our contemporaries who are naming kids, they always have some deep meaning. Whereas if I talk to my parents, like, why'd you pick the name Max? I don't know, sounded good. That's pretty much all they had going for them. And so in Hebrew culture, names were significant. They were kind of a proclamation of hope over what the destiny of the child would be. So sometimes it is indicative of the character of the parents and their hope for the child, and other times it's indicative of the nature of the person being named. And so with Abram, his name means exalted father, a great man. And we can already kind of see the irony. He's being introduced in our story at 75 years of age with the name exalted father, and as far as we know, no children. So Abram, he's encountering God here. He's coming from a pagan background. And what we see is that God meets with Abram. We don't get the specifics, but what we get is a calling. He calls him from Ur to a promised land that will be shown. And so when we think about the calling that Abram receives, this is the first kind of deposit of a covenant that God is making with Abram. And when we think about covenants, this is something we'll talk about as our study progresses. A covenant is an oath between two parties in which they obligate themselves to one another. And we're going to talk more explicitly about covenant structures when we get to chapter 15, because that's really where we see the covenant fleshed out more fully in detail. But I want to identify Genesis 12 as the moment where the covenant promises between God and Abram are really initiated. And if we really broke this covenant down into all of its parts, what we would see is that it has 7 parts to it. And actually in your workbook, you worked through these 7 parts in a little table. The reason that's significant is in a Hebrew mindset, 7 is a complete number. So this is a 7-fold covenant promise, means that this is a covenant that encompasses everything that could be hoped for Abram. When we're thinking about it for today, though, I think we really only need to think about 2 pieces to this covenant. 2 pieces to our covenant. It's the call from and the call to. The call from and the call to. So Abram, he is being called from what he knows, his country, his kindred, his father's household, into a foreign land, a place he doesn't know, with a God that he presumably has just met. And this can seem a little bit blah to us, I think, because it's very normal in our culture for somebody to move and separate themselves from their parents. In fact, sometimes we give a biblical justification for that. In Genesis, when marriage is introduced, the marital covenant, the language that's used is leaving a father or mother and cleaving to or clinging to a spouse. And so we look at that and we say, yeah, it's a normal and natural and good thing for when somebody gets married, they leave and they go to a new place. But in an ancient Near Eastern culture, or even in a modern Near Eastern culture, if you have any neighbors who come from an Eastern tradition, you'll find that it is very normal for intergenerational families to exist. And that's especially true in Abram's day and age, in which an occupation was often handed down from father to son. So for Abram to be setting out on his own, this means that he's leaving behind everybody that he knew. He's leaving behind his job prospects. He's probably leaving behind marriage prospects as well, because it is very common for families to intermarry within a community where you were known and others knew what your background was, what the history of your family was, what your job outlooks were. To be a foreigner in this setting was not necessarily a desirable thing. So Abram is leaving behind a lot to answer the call that is being put upon him. And when he's told that he's leaving for Canaan, this is kind of implicit in the text. It takes kind of careful reading here to see it. But the verb tense suggests that Abram actually received this call before they came to Haran. So if you're remembering our story, Abram and his family under Terah are in Ur. As a family, they move to Haran. After Terah dies, Abram then goes on to the Promised Land. Now, the reason that progression is significant is because if it's true that the verb tense is suggesting Abram actually received this call back in Ur, what that means is that he was slow to obey. He didn't actually progress on to where God was calling him until Terah passed away, right? And so this is our first kind of indication. This is the first test, so to speak. Our main idea tonight is that the testing of our faith reveals the object of our worship. In a sense, the very call Abram receives is the very first test in his story. And what we see from the outset is that Abram is slow to believe. He's slow to respond. He receives a call, but it takes the death of his father to really spur him into action. But at the same time, his testing is revealing he does worship God. It's just kind of taking him a while to get around to it. So that's the call from. Abram is being called from all these things. He's being called to a whole host of other things. And so God says that he's calling Abram to a land that he will show Abram. Doesn't get more ambiguous than that. Leave everything you know and come to a land, I'll show it to you. This is the kind of thing that would make me really nervous to be obeying this call. I will be shown it. This is faith. This is really Abram's faith in the crucible. He's being tested. He's being refined. And this is an example of faith that we see in Abram that is more of the variety of hoping for something unseen based on what he knows of God. Hoping for something unseen based on what he knows of God. That is the initial outset of the faith of Abram. But what we're going to see as the story progresses is as Abram's relationship with God deepens, as he can look back on more and more examples of how God has faithfully interceded and acted on Abram's behalf, it won't just be hoping for something unseen. It'll be a remembrance of what God has done and then acting in light of that remembrance. And so this call, it's a call to a land I will show you. And taking a step back from our text immediately in Genesis 12, one thing for us to recognize is Abram's story really is split into two pieces. The first piece is chapters 12 through 16, and the chapters 12 through 16 concern themselves with land. How is Abram going to be in the land? And then 17 through the end is going to focus more on the promise of descendants. How will Abram have a descendant that will come from him? So that may help you orient yourself in the story to come. As God calls him to obey in leaving, he says, I will bless you. And the covenant structure, it is arranged around 5 blessing statements, and 12 times the word you is employed. So if we're just taking a high-level view of this covenant structure, we see that the emphases are blessing. God's out here to bless Abram. That's his ultimate goal. And Abram is specifically the target of his blessing. And this is significant because what we're going to find introduced into the Jewish faith and then in the Christian faith is this concept that one person stands as a mediator, stands as an intercessor between God and man. One person does. So at this moment in time, it's Abram. If we look back in the story, it was Adam and it was Noah. If we look at what's coming in the story, it's going to be Abram's descendants all the way to David the king, and ultimately will culminate in Jesus. So the Christian faith as a whole is predicated on this idea that's being introduced right here. God is establishing a covenant with an individual. And what we're going to see in the Abram story is it kind of puts us on shaky ground, because Abram doesn't always measure up to what we would hope. But the good news is ultimately we'll find resolution in Jesus as the one who is participating in the covenant on our behalf and then ties us in to the family of God. And so God is saying, I will bless you. Implicit in this blessing statement is the idea that Abram will be fruitful, that he will have children. And again, if we're thinking about the story that preceded, so immediately before the story of Abram, we had the story of the Tower of Babel. And what we see there is mankind has come together. They conspire with one another and they say, let us make a great name for ourselves. So that's the issue at the heart of that story. Man has come together to say, let's make a great name for ourselves. Kind of translating that to what they're actually doing. They want to usurp God's role. They want to reign in the heavens as opposed to being reigned over by God. And so it's interesting here in the covenant that Abraham is being given. God explicitly says to Abram, he wants to make his name great. And this is kind of a head-scratching moment. So in chapter 11, we see God was displeased that man had come together to make a great name for himself. Yet in chapter 12, he's promising, I will make your name great. What's the difference between the two? Well, in chapter 11, we see mankind is coming together by his own strength, by his own power to say, I need no God. I will be God of my own life. But God enters the life of Abram, and he says, here's a couple who has no children, who has no earthly possibility of having children. I'm going to bestow a covenant upon them rooted in grace. It's not something that they've earned. It's not something that they've done. And there will be zero question that they have achieved something great. My greatness will show through because I've done something they could not have done apart from me. And so that's what's going on in the background here. There was a question in your workbook that I thought was kind of provocative. It said, what qualities would Abram have to be the father of a great nation? And I thought this was an interesting question because if we think about it in worldly terms, if I were to set you out and say, what would we hope for in somebody who's going to have a nation that's going to bless the entire earth? Well, we'd probably say we want them to have good genes. Probably, given our context that we're talking about in the story, we want them to have a lot of kids. We want them to have land to raise those kids on. We want it to be good, fruitful land. And what do we find in Abram's story? We don't really know much about his genes. He has no land. He has no descendants. He's wandering through the desert. So it seems like a pretty unexpected place for the father of a great nation to begin. But again, this is why God is acting through Abram so that it will be known that God is the one acting. And this is one of these places where I think it may be helpful for us to pause and think about the audiences over time and how they would have read this story. If we think about the original audience, Israel in the wilderness, having exited Egypt, standing on the cusp of the promised land, they're this disheveled kind of ragtag people who are looking at going into the promised land against a very militarily advanced civilization or civilizations. And there is a temptation for them to think there's no way we can do this. But what they're being reminded of is God works through unexpected practices. He does things that are upside down to our logic, right? If we think about the ongoing audience, the people of Israel as a kingdom over time, what we see is that the people wanted to put their trust in a king who had military might. They wanted to be like the nations around them. And yet God raises up a poet king, David, right? The writer of Psalms and a shepherd. Somebody who doesn't fit their picture, Because again, God wants to subvert their expectations. He wants to show them his kingdom does not come about in the same way. His kingdom is ruled by meekness, by mildness, by kindness, by loving others, not by might and domination. And ultimately, we as the church see this, right? We don't participate in the power structures of our world. We don't try to get ahead politically or monetarily. Instead, we put our hope and our trust in Jesus, who reigns as king, right? And so, again, when we find ourselves kind of like, well, what's the point of this? I think it's helpful to filter through those three audiences. So the call to, God is saying, Abram, I'm calling you to, and he closes with two phrases. He says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So this is significant. We talked about it a little bit already, but Abram is going to be viewed in our story as an intermediary between God and the nations around him. And then God closes by saying, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. God's choice is to break into this man, to build into him so that he might erupt outwards and change the world, right? It reminds me of Jesus' teaching of the parable of the mustard seed, right? This tiny seed that will grow forth to cover a great area, to provide shade, to provide home. This is the call of the church. God is breaking into our lives that we might erupt outwards to serve his kingdom. And so Abram's response is that he goes. He listens to God and he goes. His faith here is on display. And so what we see, this very first test, although Abram is slow to believe, he's slow to obey, he obeys God, and we see that he worships God. The testing of his faith reveals the object of his worship is God. It's not the comfort of home. It's not the security a job provides. It is the promise of relationship with God, even if that means he's going to be a wandering herdsman in the middle of a desert culture, right? And so we see, so Abram goes and he brings Lot with him. And I want to pause here. We can, I think, overread a little bit about the fact that Abram is bringing Lot with him. If you're familiar with the story that's following, Lot is going to cause some problems. And so we might be tempted to think here, well, God didn't explicitly say bring Lot. Abram did choose to bring Lot. That's probably wrong. I don't know. I mean, Lot is orphaned, right? He has no father. I have a hard time believing that Abram choosing to take in his orphaned nephew as a child is a bad thing. So I think this is more of just detail that's going to help us understand the story to come. We see a statement of Abram's age, that he's 75. Again, this is building in us the expectation that if there is a great nation to come from Abram, from the very outset, it must be God who's going to do it. And we see this phrase, Abram took all of his possessions. So this is a clue to us that Abram was a man of wealth. If he is poor, he's not taking a bunch of possessions with him. And so this, I think, builds in us a greater sense of how significant it was that Abram left the comfort behind of his home. He was a man of great means. But it may also help kind of inform our mental picture of Abram. We shouldn't think like homeless guy wandering around. We should think an Arab sheik, maybe, wandering through the desert with a train behind him of animals and of servants. And so we see that God introduces this part of the story by saying, the promised land I will show you, but we don't get pictures on how they were guided. And again, I think this is intentional because if we think about our three audiences, you have the audience immediately out of the Exodus of Egypt who's being guided by God by a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. And so as they read the story, they're able to think, I know what it's like for God to guide us. If we think of the ongoing audience, the nation of Israel over time, they are guided by prophets that God raises up to rebuke and call them back to faithful worship of God. And so as they're reading the story, they're thinking, I know what it is to be guided by God. And we as the church, we're guided by God through the Word, through His Spirit, through the church community helping guide us. And so we know what it's like to be guided by God. And so again, we ought to see our story in the story of Abram. God is calling all of us to a land that He will show us, and we are following Him. And so we see our story progresses. Abram comes to a land, and the first stop he makes in this land is an oak tree. And you're going to notice throughout our story of Abram, there's a lot of oak trees. These are images of Eden. and they are a hint to us that the tree of life is not forever excluded, but there's a hope that we will one day return to the tree of life. Excuse me. So we see the first thing Abram does upon arriving in the land is he builds an altar. He commemorates through sacrifice that he is being blessed by God. He remembers. We could talk a little bit more about altars. We're going to talk more about it in Genesis 15, again with the covenant ceremony that will take place there. The thing I want to call out here as we think about this altar is Abram takes a physical action. He builds something, he sacrifices something, he's remembering. And in the same way, we remember when we partake in the Lord's Supper, in communion. There's a reason that Jesus, when he instructs his disciples to, whenever you gather, break the bread, drink the cup, he's giving them physical instructions. He's not saying, hey, every week I want you to take 2 minutes and just pause and reflect. That's not his instruction. His instruction is to have a meal. And the reason is we experience things and it causes us to internalize them more. Abram, as he's doing this altar scene, what he's doing is he's internalizing the promises of God that have been given to him. He's rejoicing in, God promised me there would be a land, and now I'm sitting here in the land. It's not his yet, but he's remembering and rehearsing that to himself. And I think that's significant for us, that we recall that God calls us to rehearse and remember the things that he's done for us. We're meant to internalize those things. And so there's this already not yet tension present in Abram's story. He's been brought to the land, but we almost immediately hear that the land is actually for his descendants. And so there's rejoicing, but there's waiting. And we find ourselves in a very similar place, right? We are rejoicing in what's been accomplished for us in Christ, yet we are waiting for his return and the full fulfillment. And so when we're thinking about the testing of our faith, revealing the object of our worship, what we're going to find in Abram's story is this next scene as they move into Egypt is the first real test beyond his call that Abram has faced, and he fails it pretty spectacularly. So the scene is set up in 1210 by the introduction of a famine. And if you were with us in our Ruth study, you'll find that this feels really familiar. A famine begins, and you've got to think for a second, put yourself in Abram's shoes. God has just called Abram away from wealth to a home that he doesn't yet possess. And it's supposed to be the promised land, a land where he will have descendants. So he's hopeful that it will be a fruitful land. And one of the first things that happens to him there is he experiences famine. That would be something that would try my faith, certainly. And so in the midst of this famine, Abram is forced to figure out, where am I going to go? How am I going to eat? And so he flies to Egypt. And as he goes, he makes this plan in his mind that he's going to pass Sarai off as his sister. And this is unquestionably a terrible thing. I want us to think, though, there's probably a reason that Abram feels that he needs to make a plan. Chances are, if Abram, as he's entering Egypt, thinks, I need to figure out something to do with Sarai because she's beautiful and Pharaoh will desire her, probably Pharaoh has a reputation that precedes him. Abram wouldn't think to do this unless it were Pharaoh's reputation that he takes beautiful women for himself and puts their husbands to death. That seems to be Abram's fear in the result of this story. And really what we see is, in this way, Abram is echoing multiple stories that have come before him. So this scene of Pharaoh building a harem for himself, it echoes Genesis 6, the world before the flood, in which there was rampant sexual deviation from God's norms. And it echoes Genesis 3, in which Adam does not fulfill his role as husband, but offers up his wife to endure temptation in Adam's case and to be part of a harem in Sarai's case. And so we see Abram kind of imaging those who have gone before, and this is almost a gut punch for us here because we're hoping, okay, maybe Terah's descendant will be the one, but from the very get-go, it's looking like, oh man, this guy is not who we hoped he would be. And what we see is Abram's explicit phrase, the reasoning he gives for offering up Sarai freely, is he says, so my life will be spared, that my life may be spared. The testing of Abram's faith reveals that the object of worship that he has is himself. He's concerned with himself. And so you did the reading, you're familiar with how the story plays out. What we see is that ultimately God plagues Pharaoh with plagues, which This ought to be an indicator for us that the original audience certainly would have been familiar with this. I think this is a reminder to us that governments do not tend to have a long memory, right? So what we see in Egypt's past, God had delivered plagues upon them for their wrongdoings. And in the midst of those plagues, Pharaoh had repented and released Abram and Sarai. And yet the exact same thing is going to unfold. And this is a good reminder to us that we should not entrust ourselves to worldly powers as our ultimate hopes of salvation, because they have short memories. They don't learn, right? I'm sure we've seen this in many political settings. It seems like things just repeat over and over again. And that's true in Abram's case as well. But there's this interesting thing that happens, this interchange between Pharaoh and Abram, in which Pharaoh rebukes Abram for his wrongdoing. He says, "Why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me this woman was your sister?" And in a sense, Abram isn't lying, because technically Sarai is his sister, which is kind of an issue in and of itself. But we see that Pharaoh is calling Abram to account, saying, "What kind of man are you?" And what we're going to see is that it's going to be the regular experience of the people of Israel, that they're meant to be a people set apart for God, and yet the nations are going to shame them by showing, hey, you're not as good as you're supposed to be. And really the sad truth is this is sometimes true for the church. Sometimes secular institutions reveal hypocrisy within the church. And all I can say there is, it is good news for me, it is good news for us, that God loves us even when we are hypocritical. And so what we see is that Abram and Sarai, they're sent away with all sorts of new possessions. And this is a testament that just because we experience material blessing does not necessitate that we came about it in good or right ways. Abram experiences material increase here, but he did not do the right thing. The testing of his faith revealed that the object of his worship was himself. When we're looking at this Exodus event, what we ought to see is that God blesses us even when we fail, which is an incredible truth, right? This seems so crazy to me. God blesses us even when we fail, even when we mess up, even when Abram has given his wife away. This woman who he's supposed to be entrusted with protecting as his own flesh, he gives her away. He comes out richer. What a backwards experience. What a merciful God that Abram serves, that would be the case. And what the Bible is inviting us into is it's inviting us to participate in Abram's story, right? What we're going to see is the story of Abram is not unique to this moment. The nation of Israel is going to come out of Egypt, and it's going to have found itself enriched by its time there. There's going to be a later episode where Esther will be in the court of a foreign king, and she's going to come out enriched for the good of God's people. We find that we come out enriched in the midst of our being in the world, right? And so in all of these things, I hope, again, that we will start to see ourselves in the story of Abram, that God came to a pagan who didn't know him and spoke to Abram. He said, "Come with me to a new land that I will show you." He put him to the test so that Abram might see what his faith was made of. And when Abram saw that his faith was lacking, God does not punish him, but brings him out with greater wealth. That's the character of our God, and that is good news. But we ought to, at the conclusion of chapter 12 here, be left with a longing for more. Still, the problem of the line of the serpent has not been resolved. We are still looking for the promised one who will come from the line of the woman. And so our first test for Abram has been a failure, yet God in his mercy is going to provide more tests. And again, we're thinking about these tests not as pass-fail arrangements. These tests are opportunities that reveal what we worship. We've seen Abram has a self-preservation element present. And I'm sure if you think about your own life, you can think about how when the Lord has tested you, it has revealed things that you worship. And so let us be attentive to that as we continue in our study. I'll catch you next week.